I'm going to talk today about the science of violence, compassion, and the brain. And I hope by the end that I'll be able to compel you to recognize that while we are just animals and potentially resigned to the base instincts of potentially even violence and aggressive behavior, what makes us different as animals on the planet, what makes us humans, is our capacity for imagination, for introspection, for the ability to share our imaginations and live in a community setting where we can strive to make the world better. And ultimately, in order to be human, requires us to understand what it means to and to strive to be humane. Let's start with some numbers. Unfortunately, when I go over the statistics, people are oftentimes not very surprised, maybe a little bit jaded, when we hear things that, like, a violent crime occurs in our country every 26 seconds. This includes aggravated assault, a rape every 4 minutes, and a homicide roughly every 30 minutes. When it comes to violence to self, somebody dies by suicide every 14 minutes in our country, and due to a drug overdose every 12 minutes. And while these are sobering statistics, it's easy to get really inured and desensitized to hearing them and to feeling what they mean to us because of the sensationalized nature of our mass media. Unfortunately, I come before you guys today as the face of these statistics. My wife Jennifer and I lost, at that time, our only child, a beautiful little girl, Avielle, when she was 6 years old and murdered in her first grade classroom with 19 of her friends and classmates and 6 of her educators on a dark Friday, December 14th of 2012 in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings that took place in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And here, going along the theme of inflection, a change in angle, a change in perspective, we had a very personal anniversary this past February. Avielle had lived a beautiful 2,250 days of life. And on February 11th of this year, she'd been dead that same number of days. And every day past that, every day since then, we're left with only imagining what she could have done, what she could have been. As you can also imagine, in that depth of heartbreak, in that dark area of grief, we felt that the world was spinning out of control. And that if we didn't find something to hold on to, some reason to go on, that we'd get spun right off into this great darkness. But I come to you also today beyond just being a grieving father, and that is, I come with the perspective of a scientist. Specifically, I'm a neuroscientist by training. And I've been in the academic and the drug discovery arena for almost 3 decades now, and I know what amazing things we can accomplish when we put our imaginations, our time, and our finances behind a concerted effort to study and understand the pathologies that lead to human suffering. Look how far we've come in heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity. It seems that we can accomplish anything with those 3 things: imagination, time, and finance. And we all understand that up in the attic here, we have this wondrous organ, the brain. It helps to regulate the function of these other organs. But people are often surprised when I tell them, believe it or not, brain science is the least explored of all of our sciences. We know more about subatomic particle structures. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do what's going on between our ears here. And considering this is the organ we use to consider, it's kind of ironic how little we know about it. Whatever's not under the lamplight of science, whatever we don't understand in the invisible shadows, we make folklore of. It becomes magic. Oftentimes we fear it and approach it with trepidation. And brain science is no different. It's not uncommon to hear people refer to themselves in a dualistic fashion. You know, here's my meat on top of my feet, but where am I? I'm out here somewhere else. That's just not the case. While we don't know a lot about the exact molecular, cellular, genetic, and environmental factors that underlie our behaviors in the brain, we do know that the brain is the organ that houses our memories, our feelings, and our behaviors. So when Jennifer and I were faced with this infinite heartbreak in this darkness, needing to do something, we chose to play to our strengths as scientists. And we created a nonprofit foundation in honor of our little girl, Avielle, called the Avielle Foundation, with a two-sided mission. On the one side, we were going to promote and fund neuroscience, clinical, and public health research to explore the underpinnings, the risk factors, the biochemical factors, the environmental factors that lead to violence, and identify the protective factors that lead away from violence and towards compassion, connection, community, and resilience. But we also recognized right away that science in a vacuum really has no value if you can't give it to the everyday citizen in a way that's totally digestible, approachable, and common sense, so that when the everyday citizen's at home and in a time of crisis, they can reach into their toolbox and find something of value and meaningful to them personally. So the second half of our mission, besides research, was community engagement and education. And right away we set out on our mission early in 2013, and we found two things. One, we were encouraged that this is a hugely unmet need. Our country responds to violence, primarily with incarceration, but doesn't explore it and look at ways to prevent, intervene, or cure it. We wanted to do that, and we realized that we were going to have to bootstrap it ourselves in order to do this. The second thing we realized is that there's a huge barrier in the way. It's this invisible elephant in the room, the mental barrier. You can imagine how well this goes over in a congressional education briefing when you tell them that the problem's a big elephant in the room. But it doesn't have to be a partisan or divisive issue. Unfortunately, we contrive it to be one. There's two sides. On the one side of the aisle, there's the perspective, if you want to stop violence, look no further than the mentally ill. Obviously, the mentally ill are the ones that we need to lock up or somehow cure in order to prevent violence. And regardless of which side of the aisle you sit on or you identify with, we need to look at this from a scientific and an objective perspective. I think we can all agree that clearly somebody that's capable of knowingly hurting themselves, maybe completing a suicide, somebody that's able to rape or go into a classroom and kill little kids, they're behaving abnormally. Can we all agree on that? That's abnormal. On the other side of the aisle, though, is an important response to this, and this perspective is critical that we understand. The response is, people with mental illnesses are more likely to be victims of violence than to be perpetrators. And why it's so important that we understand this is because right now in our world, we define mental illnesses based on the presence of symptoms or groups of symptoms that we call syndromes. Answering yes or no to questions on a questionnaire. There's no pathologies identified. As a result, there's a lot of unknown. There's no hope associated with the mental world, the mental illnesses. So people move away from instead of leaning into getting help when they need it most. People shy away from it because of shame, fear, trepidation, embarrassment. They feel that it's a character flaw or a weakness when there's a problem with this organ, the brain. They have a mental diagnosis. Under this umbrella of mental illness, there's a lot of people standing. You'd be surprised. Roughly 25% of us are going to face some kind of mental illness challenge within our lives, if we're not already. And as a whole population, statistically, of course, they're more likely to be victims than to be perpetrators. And we need to understand that so that they're not afraid to get help. We're not fearing them. But it's also irresponsible to ignore the fact that many of the diseases that fit under this umbrella are diagnosed based on the presence of aggressive or violent behavior. We need to completely back up. We need to recognize that the brain is just another organ. Like the heart, the lung, the liver, the kidneys, it can be healthy and it can be unhealthy. And it's the house of our memories, our feelings, and our behaviors. And we all just agreed violence is an abnormal behavior. It therefore must simply be the organic and tangible consequence of abnormal chemistry or structure. There's nothing else there. It's not magic. It's not an invisible elephant in the room. We need a change in perspective. So here's our second inflection point of the night. We need to move away from the invisible world of mental, where we define individuals and give them unique adjectives to label them their disease. Think about it. Is it strange to hear somebody called schizophrenic, you are depressed, you are bipolar, your child is fill in the blank. It should sound strange to label somebody a disease. This doesn't give anybody hope. We haven't given them an actual tangible diagnosis. We haven't found a pathology. What we need to do is put our imaginations, time, and finances behind concerted efforts to make the invisible world of mental a visible and tangible world of brain health. We need to build some bridges between the biochemical sciences and the behavioral sciences. Put some of these pieces of the puzzle in so that a parent can walk into a doctor and hear, instead of, he answered yes to 5 out of 9 questions on a questionnaire, instead they can hear, hey, little Johnny's got too much dopamine in his right cingulate cortex, which is just a fancy pants way of saying this totally explains his impulse control problems in the classroom. Here's what we're going to do to work on it. Now, a parent is still responsible for advocating for their health or their child's health, but now there's hope. Now there's no shame associated with it. It's not a broken child or a character flaw, and they're going to lean into getting help like they would for any other diseased organ. This is the critical part here. Here's our third inflection as I tie it up. I need you to lend me your imaginations. I need to encourage you to look for that inflection. Maybe you haven't been touched by violence personally, but you're encouraged to engage and change your perspective. Look at this picture of Avielle running with reckless abandon. Her feet aren't even touching the ground. What great potential she could have had. What a tragedy that kids are killed on our street corners and in our homes and our schools every hour. Let that touch you. Let it motivate you and encourage you to do something, to roll your sleeves up. And then here are my 3 asks. 1, support brain health research. Yeah, financially, that'd be good because, as I said, we're going to have to bootstrap it. We are going to make this a change. We don't do violence research. We react to it. We need to change that. We need to see it as a disease that can be prevented, intervened, and cured. So support it. The second ask is engage. Find that person that you don't necessarily agree with and listen to them. Have a discussion. These aren't comfortable things to do. But guess what? No change occurs in your comfort zone. Change only occurs outside your comfort zone, where you're not necessarily used to what you're looking at or hearing. Listen first. Try to acknowledge what somebody that's different than you feels and what they think. Have those difficult conversations and engage people with different ideas than you. This is really the meaning of celebrating diversity. Diversity of imaginations is critical. And the third thing is educate yourself. This starts not with a classroom, but with some introspection. We are animals, and we are wired in very particular ways. One of them is to create a lot of biases, the way that we see the world. We all have implicit bias. We need to look inside ourselves and identify what they are and ask if they're rational or not. And if they're not, weed them out, because if you don't actively try to, then they'll become explicit bias. Those are our isms: racism, sexism, classism. We need to weed those out. Then we can educate ourselves on what we know and what we know we don't know, so that we can prevent violence and build compassion. At the end of the day, we need to evolve. Though we need to recognize, yes, we are just animals, but what sets us aside is our great capacity for imagination, sharing ideas. We are built and wired to live in a community setting. We need to play up to that potential, to that role. We have the responsibility to recognize that we have to learn how to be humane in order to be human. Thank you for your imaginations, and I appreciate your time.